Have you ever dreamed of a life filled with luxury, love, and endless possibilities? For Sarah, that dream seemed to come true when a wealthy businessman swept her off her feet. But as she sat in a lavish restaurant, a diamond ring glinting in the candlelight, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was about to destroy everything. This is the story of how she married for money, and how her secret tore it all apart. The restaurant was the epitome of luxury, a place where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft golden glow over the room. The tables were adorned with white linen tablecloths, fine china, and fresh roses. A pianist played a gentle melody in the corner, adding to the romantic ambiance. Sarah sat at a table by the window, overlooking the city skyline. She felt out of place in her simple black dress, surrounded by women in designer gowns and men in tailored suits. But Daniel had insisted on bringing her here, saying it was a special night. She glanced at him across the table, her heart fluttering. Daniel was everything she'd ever dreamed of, handsome, successful, and kind. He'd swept her off her feet from the moment they'd met, showering her with gifts and attention. But tonight, something felt different. There was a nervous energy in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. Sarah had grown up in a small town, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet. She'd always dreamed of a better life, of escaping the poverty and hardship that had defined her childhood. When she moved to the city after high school, she'd been determined to make something of herself. She worked long hours at a diner, saving every penny she could. But no matter how hard she worked, she couldn't seem to get ahead. Then she met Daniel. He'd come into the diner one evening, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than she made in a month. He'd smiled at her, and something in his eyes had made her heart skip a beat. "What's your name?" he'd asked, his voice smooth and confident. "Sarah," she'd replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Well, Sarah," he'd said, "you're far too beautiful to be working in a place like this." She'd laughed, brushing off the compliment. But Daniel had been persistent. He'd come back every night, always sitting at her table, always leaving a generous tip. One evening, he'd asked her out. "I'd love to take you somewhere special," he'd said. "Somewhere worthy of you." Sarah had hesitated. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and part of her wondered what a man like Daniel could possibly see in someone like her. But she'd said yes, and that had been the start of everything. Now, as she sat across from him in the luxurious restaurant, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She'd never told Daniel about her past, about the life she'd left behind. She'd been too afraid that he'd see her differently, that he'd realize she wasn't good enough for him. "You're quiet tonight," Daniel said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. She forced a smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "About us. About how lucky I am to have you." Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm the lucky one, Sarah. You've brought so much joy into my life." His words warmed her heart, but they also deepened her guilt. She wanted to tell him the truth, to share the burden of her past, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not tonight. As the dessert course arrived, a decadent chocolate cake topped with gold leaf, Daniel's nervous energy seemed to intensify. He kept glancing at his watch, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, concerned. Daniel smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything's perfect." Before she could press further, the pianist began playing a new song, a romantic ballad that made Sarah's heart swell. She turned to look at the musician, and when she turned back, Daniel was down on one knee, holding a small velvet box. Her breath caught in her throat. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were special. You've brought so much light into my life, and I can't imagine a future without you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked at the ring, a stunning diamond that sparkled in the candlelight. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. "Daniel, she began, her voice trembling. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with hope and love. "Say yes, Sarah. Let me give you the life you deserve." Her heart ached at his words. She wanted to say yes, to embrace the future he was offering. But the weight of her secret pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. "Yes," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Daniel's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. The restaurant erupted in applause, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was racing, her heart torn between happiness and fear. As they left the restaurant, Daniel's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Sarah felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. She was thrilled to be engaged, to have a future with the man she loved. But the guilt of her secret weighed heavily on her heart. "I can't wait to start our life together," Daniel said, his voice filled with excitement. Sarah forced a smile. "Me too." But as they drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was lurking just around the corner, waiting to destroy everything she'd worked so hard to build. The wedding was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of, and nothing like she'd imagined. The ceremony took place in a grand cathedral, its towering ceilings adorned with intricate stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns of light onto the marble floor. The pews were filled with Daniel's wealthy friends and family, all dressed in their finest attire. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, their vibrant colors adding to the opulence of the occasion. Sarah stood at the back of the cathedral, her heart pounding as she waited for the music to begin. She wore a custom-designed gown that had cost more than she'd ever dreamed of spending on a single item. The delicate lace hugged her figure perfectly, and the long train trailed behind her like a river of silk. A diamond tiara sparkled in her hair, and the ring Daniel had given her glinted on her finger. She looked every bit the blushing bride, but inside she was a storm of emotions. Sarah had spent the weeks leading up to the wedding in a whirlwind of preparations. Daniel had spared no expense, ensuring that every detail was perfect. There were dress fittings, cake tastings, and endless meetings with wedding planners. But amidst the excitement, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She'd never told Daniel about her past, about the life she'd left behind. She'd been too afraid that he'd see her differently, that he'd realize she wasn't good enough for him. Now, as she stood at the threshold of the cathedral, she felt the weight of her secret more than ever. The music began, a soft melodic tune that filled the cathedral. Sarah took a deep breath and began her walk down the aisle. All eyes were on her as she moved slowly toward the altar, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands. She tried to focus on Daniel, who stood at the front of the church, his eyes filled with love and admiration. But her gaze kept drifting to the faces in the crowd, searching for something or someone. And then she saw him. He was sitting near the back, his face partially hidden in the shadows. But there was no mistaking him. It was the man from her past, the one she'd hoped she'd never see again. Her heart skipped a beat, and she nearly stumbled. How had he found her? What was he doing here? For a moment, she considered turning around, running away from the cathedral and never looking back. But then she caught Daniel's eye, and the love she saw there gave her the strength to keep going. She reached the altar and took her place beside Daniel, her hands trembling as she handed her bouquet to the maid of honor. "You look beautiful," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with awe. Sarah forced a smile, but her mind was racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the man in the crowd, about the secret he could expose at any moment. The ceremony began, the priest's voice echoing through the cathedral as he spoke of love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. Sarah tried to focus on his words, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in the crowd. When it was time to exchange vows, Daniel took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady and sincere, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were special. You've brought so much light into my life, and I can't imagine a future without you. I promise to love you, to cherish you, and to stand by your side through whatever life throws our way." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she listened to his words. She wanted to believe them, to believe that they could build a life together, but the weight of her secret pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and tried to steady her voice. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling, "you've given me more than I ever thought possible. You've shown me a world of love and kindness, and I promise to do everything in my power to make you happy. I promise to love you, to support you, and to be the partner you deserve." As she spoke the words, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She was lying to him, hiding a part of herself that could destroy everything they'd built. After the ceremony, the newlyweds made their way to the reception hall, a grand ballroom decorated with twinkling lights and cascading floral arrangements. The room was filled with laughter and music, the guests mingling and celebrating the happy couple. Sarah tried to enjoy the festivities, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept glancing around the room, searching for the man from her past, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little overwhelmed." Daniel squeezed her hand. "It's a big day, but you're doing great." She nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. She couldn't shake the feeling that her past was lurking just around the corner, waiting to destroy everything she'd worked so hard to build. As the evening wore on, Daniel led Sarah to the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The band played a soft, romantic melody, and the guests gathered around to watch. Daniel held her close, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered. "I love you too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But as they danced, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the man in the crowd. What did he want? Why had he come? As the night came to an end, Sarah and Daniel made their way to the limo that would take them to their honeymoon suite. Sarah was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. "Today was perfect," Daniel said, his voice filled with contentment. Sarah forced a smile. It was. But as they drove away from the reception, she couldn't shake the feeling that her perfect day might be the beginning of her worst nightmare. The honeymoon suite was a paradise of luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The room was adorned with fresh flowers, their sweet scent filling the air, and a bottle of champagne chilled in a silver bucket on the table. Sarah stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out at the twinkling lights below. She should have been happy. This was supposed to be the happiest time of her life, but the weight of her secret pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Daniel walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You've been quiet all evening," he said, his voice soft with concern. "Is everything okay?" Sarah forced a smile, leaning back into his embrace. "I'm fine, just tired." Daniel kissed her temple. "It's been a long day. Why don't we open the champagne and relax?" She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the man she'd seen at the wedding, about the secret he could expose at any moment. As Daniel poured the champagne, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart skipped a beat and she froze, her eyes darting to the door. "Who could that be?" Daniel asked, setting the bottle down and walking to the door. Sarah's mind raced. What if it was him? What if he'd followed them here? Daniel opened the door, and Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. Standing in the hallway was the man from her past, his expression cold and calculating. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his tone polite but wary. The man's eyes flicked to Sarah, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'm here to see Sarah." Daniel turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sarah, do you know this man?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt like the walls were closing in around her. She wanted to deny it, to tell Daniel she had no idea who he was, but the look in the man's eyes told her that wouldn't work. I need to talk to him," she said, her voice trembling. Daniel's confusion deepened, but he stepped aside, allowing the man to enter the room. The man walked in, his eyes scanning the luxurious suite with a look of disdain. "Nice place," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've done well for yourself, Sarah." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" The man's smirk widened. "What do I want? I want what's owed to me. You thought you could run away from your past, but you can't. Not from me." Daniel stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Who are you, and what are you talking about?" The man turned to Daniel, his expression cold. "Your wife and I have some unfinished business. Isn't that right, Sarah?" Sarah's heart raced, and she felt like she was going to be sick. She wanted to tell Daniel the truth, to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. "Daniel, she began, her voice breaking. The man cut her off. "Let me save you the trouble. Sarah and I were married once, but she left me, ran away without a word, and now she's living this fancy life while I'm left with nothing." Daniel's face went pale, and he turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with shock and betrayal. "Is this true?" Sarah's tears spilled over, and she nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Daniel stared at Sarah, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. "How could you keep this from me?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Sarah shook her head, her tears falling freely. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought if you knew, you wouldn't want me anymore." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Sarah, you should have told me. I deserved to know the truth." The man from her past smirked, clearly enjoying the chaos he'd caused. "Well, now that the cat's out of the bag, let's talk about what I want." Daniel turned to him, his anger flaring. "You need to leave, now." The man held up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, I'll go. But this isn't over, Sarah. You owe me, and I always collect." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah and Daniel alone in the tense silence. Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She felt like her world was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Daniel stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "How long were you going to keep this from me?" Sarah looked up, her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared, Daniel, scared of losing you." Daniel turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "You lied to me, Sarah. You kept something huge from me. How am I supposed to trust you now?" Sarah's tears fell harder, and she shook her head. "I don't know. But I love you, Daniel. I never wanted to hurt you." Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. "I need some time to think. I can't do this right now." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and regret. The days following the confrontation in the honeymoon suite were a blur for Sarah. Daniel had left the room that night, and they hadn't spoken since. He'd taken a separate room in the hotel, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and regret. She spent her days wandering the city, trying to clear her mind, but the weight of her secret followed her everywhere she went. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about the pain she'd caused him, and about the man from her past who'd threatened to destroy everything. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in a cafe, nursing a cup of coffee, the man from her past appeared at her table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his tone mocking. Sarah's heart raced and she glanced around, hoping no one was watching. "What do you want?" she hissed. The man smirked as he sat down across from her. "I told you, Sarah, you owe me, and I always collect." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee cup. "I don't have anything to give you. Please just leave me alone." The man leaned forward, his expression darkening. "You think you can just walk away from your past? You think you can live this fancy life while I'm left with nothing? Think again." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "What do you want from me?" The man's smirk returned. "Money, a lot of it. And if you don't give it to me, I'll make sure Daniel knows everything. Every dirty little secret you've been hiding." Sarah's heart sank. She didn't have the money he was asking for, and even if she did, she knew it wouldn't end there. He'd keep coming back, demanding more and more. That evening, Sarah returned to the hotel, her mind made up. She couldn't keep running from her past. She had to face it, no matter the consequences. She found Daniel in the hotel bar, sitting alone with a drink in his hand. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They found a quiet corner of the bar, and Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was scared. Scared of losing you, scared of what you'd think of me if you knew the truth." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Sarah took another deep breath. "The man from the wedding, his name is Mark. We were married a long time ago. It was a mistake, Daniel. I was young and naive, and I didn't know any better. He was abusive, and I ran away. I thought I could start over, leave my past behind. But he found me, and now he's threatening to expose everything." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "I should have told you, Daniel. I should have trusted you, but I was so scared of losing you, of losing everything we've built together." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand over his face. "Sarah, I don't know what to say. You lied to me. You kept something huge from me. How am I supposed to trust you now?" Sarah's heart ached at his words. "I don't know, Daniel, but I love you. I never wanted to hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Daniel was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the drink in his hand. Finally, he looked up at Sarah, his expression filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I need some time to think," he said, his voice steady but distant. "This is a lot to process, Sarah. I need to figure out what I want." Sarah nodded, her tears falling harder. "I understand. Take all the time you need." With that, Daniel stood up and walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt and regret. The days following Sarah's confession to Daniel were filled with tension and uncertainty. They'd returned home from their honeymoon, but the warmth and joy that should have filled their new life together were replaced with silence and distance. Daniel had taken a room in the guest wing of their sprawling mansion, leaving Sarah to wander the halls alone. She tried to give him space, to respect his need for time to process everything, but the loneliness was unbearable. One evening, as she sat in the living room, staring into the fireplace, Daniel walked in. He looked tired, his face drawn, and his eyes shadowed with emotion. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm, "we need to talk." Sarah's heart raced as she nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Daniel sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, about us, about what happened." Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I understand. I know I hurt you, Daniel, and I'm so sorry." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "You did hurt me, Sarah. You lied to me. You kept something huge from me, and that's not easy to forgive." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. She knew he needed to say his piece. "But," Daniel continued, his voice softening, "I've also been thinking about why you did it, about how scared you must have been, and I realize that I haven't been fair to you either." Sarah blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been so focused on my own hurt that I haven't stopped to think about what you've been through, about how hard it must have been for you to carry that secret all these years." Sarah's tears spilled over, and she shook her head. "Daniel, you don't have to do this. I'm the one who messed up. I'm the one who needs to make it right." Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his. "Sarah, I love you, and I want to make this work, but we have to be honest with each other. No more secrets, no more lies." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "I promise, Daniel, no more secrets, no more lies." Over the next few days, Sarah and Daniel worked together to confront the man from her past. They hired a lawyer who helped them draft a cease and desist letter, warning him to stay away or face legal consequences. It wasn't easy. Mark was persistent, and he didn't take kindly to being threatened. But with Daniel by her side, Sarah felt stronger than she ever had before. One evening, as Sarah and Daniel were having dinner, there was a knock at the door. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at Daniel, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We'll handle this together." They walked to the door together, and Daniel opened it to reveal Mark standing on the doorstep, his expression dark and angry. "What do you want?" Daniel asked, his tone firm. Mark smirked, his eyes flicking to Sarah. "I want what's owed to me, and I'm not leaving until I get it." Daniel stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "You've been warned, Mark. If you don't leave now, we'll call the police." Mark's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "You think you can scare me? You think you can just sweep this under the rug?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "Mark, this is over. I'm not afraid of you anymore, and I'm not going to let you control my life." Mark's expression darkened, and for a moment it looked like he might lunge at her. But then he seemed to think better of it, and he took a step back. "This isn't over, Sarah," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah and Daniel standing in the doorway, their hearts pounding. As they closed the door and returned to the living room, Sarah felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. She sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, sitting beside her and taking her hand. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I think so. I can't believe it's over." Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "It's not over, Sarah, but we'll get through this together. I promise." Sarah buried her face in his chest, her tears falling freely. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. She felt loved. The weeks following the confrontation with Mark were a time of healing and rebuilding for Sarah and Daniel. They'd faced their biggest challenge yet, and while it had tested their relationship, it had also brought them closer together. One evening, as they sat on the couch in their living room, Daniel turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our future." Sarah's heart raced as she nodded, gesturing for him to continue. "What's on your mind?" Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes searching hers. "I want to start over. I want to build a life together, one that's based on trust and love, but we have to be honest with each other. No more secrets, no more lies." Sarah's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. "I want that too, Daniel. more than anything. Daniel smiled, his eyes shining with hope. Then, let's do it. Let's start over. Over the next few months, Sarah and Daniel worked together to rebuild their relationship. They went to counseling, where they learned to communicate better and to be honest about their feelings. They spent more time together, rediscovering the love and connection that had brought them together in the first place. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to Daniel, her heart swelling with love. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I just want to say thank you for standing by me, for giving us a second chance." Daniel smiled, taking her hand in his. "I love you, Sarah, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Sarah's tears spilled over, and she leaned into him, feeling safe and loved for the first time in a long time. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Sarah and Daniel sat together, their hands intertwined. They'd been through so much, but they'd come out stronger on the other side. And as they looked out at the horizon, they knew that their future was bright. Months had passed since Sarah and Daniel decided to start over, and their relationship had slowly but surely begun to heal. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt and lingering pain, but they were committed to each other and to building a stronger, healthier future together. One evening, as they sat on the couch in their cozy apartment, Daniel turned to Sarah with a smile. "I have something to show you," he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" Daniel stood up and took her hand, leading her to the small studio he'd set up in the corner of the apartment. On the easel was a new painting, a vibrant, breathtaking depiction of the two of them standing on a beach at sunset. The colors were rich and warm, and the love between them was palpable in every brushstroke. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the painting. "Daniel, it's beautiful." Daniel smiled, his voice soft. "It's us, Sarah. This is our future. Together." Sarah turned to him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I don't deserve you, Daniel, but I'm so grateful you've given me a second chance." Daniel reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "We've both made mistakes, Sarah, but what matters is that we're here now, and we're choosing each other every day." Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "I choose you, Daniel, today, tomorrow, and always." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Sarah realized that true happiness wasn't about money or status. It was about love, trust, and being with someone who truly cared for her. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the mansion, the luxury, the emptiness, and knew she'd made the right choice. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was real. He was her home. As the sun set outside their apartment, casting a warm, golden glow over the room, Sarah looked at Daniel and smiled. "Do you think we can really do this?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Daniel smiled back, his eyes filled with love. "We already are, Sarah. One day at a time." And so Sarah and Daniel began a new chapter of their lives, one built on honesty, trust, and a love that had weathered the storm. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together, because in the end, they'd learned that the greatest luxury of all was the love they shared. Dear viewers, thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe so you do not miss the coming stories.